In this video, we're going to actually walk through an end-to-end configuration of a React application that uses an Entra App Registration to authorize users and provide tokens to get to backend resources. Why would we want to do this? Well, we're developing a custom application. We want the users of that application to access Azure resources, or it could be Office 365 resources like storage accounts, REST APIs, Fabric, semantic models, anything that needs a REST token or anything that needs a token from Entra to access the backend resource. This is how we can get there. So the user story is the user goes to the app, they press some login button, probably a Microsoft login pop-up comes up that asks them to authenticate with Entra. And then at that point, the application has some tokens that it can use to provide to backend resources to authenticate that user and authorize the user as they're accessing those resources. So this process is using something called OAuth. So OAuth is a very standard way of providing identity management to an application. So in the old days, we go back decades, applications would actually have their own user IDs and passwords, and they'd have to worry about storing them in a secure way so they don't get lost. With OAuth, the application isn't responsible for that security information. The user essentially talks directly to the identity provider, which is, it talks to Entra, and does the authentication, and the application only has tokens that are short-lived. They expire in about an hour by default, and those tokens are used to access the backend resources. So it really offloads the security piece to Entra. So in order to make this work, we do need to put some information into the Entra configuration. So like the top right of this diagram is all Entra configuration. So that starts with an app registration, and we'll go through and create one of those from scratch. And the registration is essentially telling Entra that, hey, there does exist this application. It can use Entra as its identity provider. And within the app registration, we have to tell Entra what URLs the app runs on, and only apps running on those URLs can use the registration. We also optionally, but we're going to do that today, we can authorize users to use the application too. So the app registration is kind of, we can lock it down. We can leave it kind of open, but we can lock it down, and in this case we will. So we'll lock it down to certain URLs and certain users or security groups that can use it. And then within the React application, it's fairly straightforward. We just import a library that Microsoft maintains called MSAL. And what this library does is it does all the communication for us to Entra. So it redirects the user to go through that Microsoft login screen with MFA if that's required of the user. We get back tokens, and MSAL will even help us refresh those tokens as they expire throughout the day or throughout the user's session. So, I think that's about it. So let's get into it and actually do the configurations and see how this works. To get started, we'll go into Entra and choose App Registrations from the primary menu, and then click on New Registration. To complete the registration, we provide a user-facing display name for the application. So this should be descriptive and users should know what it means. In this case, I only want users in my Entra directory to log into this application, so it won't be from multiple Entra ID tenants. So I'll leave it to the default accounts in this organization directory only. For the redirect URI, I'm going to enter in the development URI that I use. So the web application in development is going to be localhost port 3000, so I'll enter that here. And when I'm done, I just click the registration button. Now I'm going to update this redirect URIs because in development we might use localhost, but in production we need to use the URL for the application as it actually will be published. Because only applications at these URLs may use this application registration, so it's important to get them right. I'm going to pretend that in production my application is my application.azurewebsites.net, so I'll add that as a URI. And then for the front channel logout, this would be where the application might get redirected if the user logged out. And so I'm just going to put in the same production URL there. On the overview screen of the application registration, we'll see the client ID and the tenant ID. These two values are important. We need to save these off and incorporate them into the front-end application. They're not secrets, but they are identifiers that connect the application with the application registration. So I'll just copy those off, put them in a text editor for now, and we'll pull them into the application when we created it. The next step is optional. I want to configure my application so that only specific users or users in security groups can use the application. So not every user in Entra, only the ones that I pick. So to do that, I'll go back to Entra and I'll go into the primary menu and choose Enterprise Applications. In the search box, I'll search for the application I just created. There it is. So I'll choose that. And on this screen, I can see several options. The main one that I want to choose first is to tell the Entra that assignment is required. Assignment required means that only users I pick can use the application. If it's set to no, any Entra user in the directory could use it, but I want to lock it down a little bit more. Now in the Manage folder, if we look at users and groups, we can see that no application assignments are actually found. This means that there are no users that are going to be able to use the application because we set it in properties to say that users have to be assigned. We didn't assign anybody. So this will create a problem when we log in the first time. The reason I'm going to leave it this way is that I want you to kind of see how it looks when it's misconfigured. We'll come back and fix this later. So we'll just put a pin in that for now and move on with creating the app. Okay, so let's create a new React app. I'm going to create a brand new one in the folder and we'll configure it from there. So I'm using Vite, so I'll use Vite to create a new application. So we'll put in npm create Vite latest and we'll give this application a name. I'm just going to use the same name that we used within Entra. And then Vite will give us some choices. It wants to know what framework, React, and we'll use TypeScript for the language. And then let's just go into that folder where the application was just scaffolded out for us. And that looks fine. Let's run Visual Studio Code so we can take a look at this. Let me make this fill the screen and make it bigger so you can see it a little better in the video. And the first thing I'm going to do is actually downgrade the React versions. Vite put in the latest and greatest version 19. The MSAL components only support up to 18, so I'm going to downgrade this so that we're using React 18 because that's what's supported. Now, by the time you watch this video, maybe 19 will be supported and you can use 19, but at the time of recording, 18 was the max, so we'll go with 18. And what we'll do next is just get a terminal going here, do our npm install to get everything installed, and then once that's done, we'll test the app and see if just the basic framework is working before we add the Entra login pieces. There, install's done, so let's go ahead and run the application. We'll test it out. And I noticed that it's picking a random port 5173. That's not the port that I told Entra that I was going to use. So this is really important. You have to use the same port when you're running the app as you told Entra you were going to use in the app registration. So I chose localhost 3000. So I'm going to configure my development environment to use port 3000. So I'll just do that by changing the Vite config. Now if I run it, it's I actually had something run on 3000 already, so it's on 3001, so I'll fix that later, but for now let's just see if this is working. And we'll go into, so I'm going to open just a guest Chrome browser that I'm going to be using for these tests. So I could use Edge, but I just chose Chrome just to show you this doesn't really require a Microsoft browser. You can use Chrome. And the app's running, that looks fine. So let's get this app configured so that it does actually what we want it to do. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is go into package. We're going to bring in the dependencies for MSAL, which is the Active Directory login. So MSAL React and MSAL Browser, those are the two we need. And I'm also going to add an environment file. So remember we saved off those two values. We had the client ID and the tenant ID, and we're going to be needing those in the application. I don't want to hard code those in the source code, so I'll create environment variables for those. And so that's our client ID. And then the authority is a URL plus the tenant ID in this case. So authority is telling Entra what kind of credentials we want. All we want is the user's ID token. So this is the authority we use for that. So it's just login with the tenant ID. And the next thing we need to do is configure the application so that it's connected to Entra. So this is essentially what we're doing, is adding a global object that is the Entra connection that we can reference then from anywhere else. And the way we do that in React is to wrap the root app with the Entra app. So anything within the app can reach up and find the Entra object to reference it. So I forgot to run npm install, so let's run that. And that looks fine. I'm just going to reopen this browser window, so make sure I pull it in. So this looks good. So it's declared but never used. All right, so let's use it. So what we're going to do here is add a few lines of code, not many. The first one is to bring in that client ID and authority. So those were in the environment file, if you remember. And those are going to be used within this initialization at the application level. And we have to, here's our MSAL configuration and a public client application. So our MSAL configuration essentially is just passing in the client ID and the authority. And then we also store what the redirect and post logout redirect URLs should be. And those should align again with the URLs that we put into the app registration. Using the / is okay because that's going to resolve to localhost 3000. So that will be accepted by Entra. And then here we create the public application, and then then we wrap an object MSAL provider, providing the instance PCA. And then anything within the application that says get instance, you'll see that a lot later where it says just get instance, it'll pick up that PCA object. So that's why we're doing that. So then the app provider is put into the application startup, and the application provider is wrapping the app. So it all kind of bubbles up. So we've just essentially wrapped the MSAL around the outside of the app so the entire app can access MSAL. So that's all we do there. So let's move on to actually getting the app configured. Maybe we'll test it one more time to make sure we haven't broken anything. So let's do that. And the app's still working, so by adding the MSAL wrapper, we didn't break anything, so that's awesome. So our next step is going to be to actually change the app's UI and add the login logout code to the app. So let's do that next. So this is the boilerplate that Vite creates, so I don't really care about the logo. I'm going to change the header to something that's meaningful for this app. So React MSAL tutorial seems fine. And what else are we going to do in here? Let's just remove this test or this demoware UI. So we'll get rid of that. We don't really need this read the docs thing either. Okay. And we'll get rid of those variables we don't need. We don't need these imports. Okay, so that's really stripped down. Now we've got just kind of a basic app, and we will add in what we actually want. Okay, so let's add in the imports. So we're going to need these use MSAL again. The browser utils will need silent request. So these are objects that we will be using in a minute, but these are the methods of MSAL that we'll use in this app. A couple state variables. So on the screen, we're going to display what the user is after they log in. We have one state variable to track whether they are logged in or not. So that'll toggle back and forth depending on which buttons they're pressing. And then at the very top, we'll grab a reference to instance. So that says use MSAL. And you recall that we wrap the whole application with this provider that provides an instance. So instance equals that PCA. So when we say use instance, we're getting that PCA object that was created at the top level. And we'll use that a lot in this configuration. So, but that's done pretty much at the top of any file that needs to use MSAL. It's just getting a reference to the global. So we'll add a use effect just to display the user if they happen to be logged in when the screen comes up. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just paste in what the UI is actually going to be. So you see here I have 3 buttons. One is to log in, a login button. I have a logout button on the bottom. And then in the middle I have a button that will show the token information. So this will get the details about their login info. They're basically their JWT token that we'll see if they're logged in. Okay, let's add stubs for those button handlers so that at least we'll get rid of the errors. So here's a stub for handle login. So these will all be async routines. They're going to be awaiting a response from Entra. So we've got handle login. got handle logout, and then handle show token info. So we'll stub these out and then run a quick test to make sure that the UI still works after all the modifications we've made so far. And with that done, let's just run a quick test, make sure the UI is still working. It is. The login button doesn't do anything. The other two buttons aren't present because we are already checking with MSAL, and MSAL is telling us we're not logged in yet. So those shouldn't be showing us yet. I noticed the buttons are kind of a boring gray color, so I'm just going to paste in some style here. So login will be green, logout will be red, and token will be purple. There, it's green, so okay, that looks good. Doesn't work, so let's make that button work. So we're gonna add the login process. This is the more complicated function, so we'll do it first. The other two are a little bit quicker and shorter, but let's do the login. So for login, we do have to cover a few different scenarios. One is that the user is already logged in with Entra, so they don't need to type in a password. Another one is they aren't logged in, they do need to type a password, and then it's possible that they could log in, but they don't have access to the application. Those will throw some exceptions. So in this routine, we'll handle all those cases. So let's go through them. So the first one is that they have decided to use the app and they're already authenticated with Entra. The first thing we'll do is try to do a silent login. In other words, they're already logged in. We just need to get their account from Entra. So we'll do this first. And you know, we've got the instance from that PCA that's global, and we'll say SSO silent. So, and we're just telling it, hey, if we already logged in, just give me a response. And if that's the case, then the user won't even see a login screen. They'll just be logged in. But if they aren't logged in already, this will throw an exception, which we'll need to catch. And so if a catch is thrown, then we're just going to console log this just so that we can see it as we're developing this, what's actually happening. But if they aren't logged in already, it'll throw an exception. And the next thing we'll do is then we'll turn around and say, okay, instance, let's do a pop-up. Let them actually type in their username and password. And they'll go through multi-factor authentication if that's required. All that will happen during this login pop-up process. And then that's our other happy path. So let's say that they did log in, then all is good, right? And if they do log in, we'll get a response back that will have a number of properties. One of them is account. That's the one that's most important to us. So we'll take that account that we get back and we'll set that as the active account within that global public application object. So that's what instance set active account. And we're recording that. So anywhere else in the application, if we want to know who is the logged in user, we can just do get active account. It'll tell us. And then we're also setting our UI variables. So setting is logged in. We'll toggle the button presences and user display, and we'll display it on the screen. Now, if they weren't able to log in for some reason, or they did log in but there is no account, we're just kind of handling that scenario here. This is a pretty unusual scenario, but because we've got an if, we need an else. The last thing we need to handle is what if they logged in completely successfully, we know who they are, Entra says they're fine, but they don't have access to the application. That also is an error that we need to catch. So we're going to wrap all of this with another try block, and this will handle the scenario where they have logged in, but they can't access the application for some reason. So we'll just add one more try block around here to catch that. And we'll actually hit this the first time we log in, because if you remember, we didn't authorize any users to use the application. So every user is going to actually hit this outside catch block, because their login is going to fail because they're not authorized. So that's login. It looks like, I think it's all done. Let's try it and let's try to run it and see what happens. And oops, something's wrong. Let's take a look at this. And what's the first error? Into the top level. Okay, we've got some braces are in the wrong spot, so probably missing a brace here. So let's just kind of count them and see what got missed. Try, close, if then. And oh, okay, yeah, just missed one. So let's put in the missing closing brace, save that, let's run it again. And here we're in localhost 3000. So we're going to go and try to run this for the first time and log in, and we'll see what happens. We'll browse to the local site. It's our green button. Click the green button. And we're getting challenged. So the silent login didn't work. So we do have to enter our password. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll sign in. And here we have an error. So this error is very common if things aren't quite set up right. We didn't complete the configuration in Entra. So your administrators configure the application to block users unless they're specifically granted. Okay, and we did say yes on that. But then this user is blocked because they're not assigned to the application. So this is expected. This is the error I intended to create for the first login. So let's we can actually look at the logs here, and we can see trying pop-up or trying silent login. See, that didn't work because they needed to authenticate. Pop-up login did work, but then it threw that last exception and it caught that there was a problem with authentication and the user canceled it. So it actually says cancel the flow because after I saw the error, I hit close on the dialog, and this is where that kind of fell through. All right, so let's go to Entra and fix that. So we'll go back to Entra, Enterprise Applications. Let's find the application again. There it is. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead and authorize this user this test user that I'm using to use the application. And if you remember, assignment required is yes. So if assignment required is no, we wouldn't have had that error because it would have allowed any Entra user. But because we said yes, we have to do the assignments. So here's where I'm going to assign users to the app. In other words, authorize users to the app. And I'm just going to add user group. And I'm using the free Entra here, so I can't assign security groups. I would rather assign security groups, but I can't do that with the free version of Entra. So I'll go ahead and just assign this one user by name. So that's the user we're logging in with. We'll select that, assign that, and now we can see that user is assigned to the application. So we'll get past that error. I will give you a hint that there's going to be another error, another misconfiguration that we're going to have to fix. But we've solved the first one, so let's go ahead and try to log in again and see what happens. Let's get the password in, so we're kind of going through that password flow again. Sign in and need admin approval. Okay, so this is a different problem. So this is with the app registration. Users need to either the user authorizes the app to fetch a token for it, or the administrator can say the entire organization is authorized. So essentially the admin can authorize the application, or each user can do it. Since we are using the enterprise application method of authorizing users, the administrator is going to need to do this. So individual users don't get to choose yes or no. It's the admin has to authorize this app within the app registration. So we'll go back to the app registration and we'll fix that. And kind of happens, new applications, things don't get quite done all the way sometimes. So let's go find our app registration again. And we are just going to go ahead and get into the API permissions, and we can see the user read. So this permission is granted. This is the one that allows access or the ID tokens to be provided to an app, but it has to be authorized. So here I'm going to, as an administrator, authorize this to all users in the directory. And I can see now I have a green check that it's been granted for the entire directory. So that should fix that error and we should be good to go. So let's test. We'll log in with Entra. Looks good. Let's put the password in again. Sign in. It wants to know if we're going to stay signed in. I'll say no because I'm just testing. Now we are logged in, so we're good to go. If we look at the log, we can see it tried the silent login, didn't work. Trying the pop-up login because I did need to authenticate with a password. That worked. This was the account. So we have in the code, we have a log, so it will we'll log the account that we get after we log in. So that's what we're seeing there. So that looks great. And then the second thing I want to show you about using MSAL is when you need to use those tokens to authorize like API calls, you have to keep in mind that these tokens expire. They expire in about 70 minutes by default. So if the user leaves the app just running for an hour or so, then the token that we required would actually have expired. It has to be refreshed, and we want to refresh that silently. So we don't want to have to put the user through a whole login process every hour. So what we're going to do is in using that show token info button, we're going to use the token info button to actually get either the current token, or if the current token is expired, to get a refresh token, to use that, for example, in an API call. So let's go ahead and implement this next function, which is showing the token, or showing the token info. So this is essentially going to get the current token or refresh the token and get a new token, and then show us on the screen what it looks like. So this is very similar. Here we'll get the active account, because in the login we set the active account. Here we're going to get the active account, and then we're going to build a request. And the request is a silent request. So we're saying we want, for this scope, in that account, we want you to either give us the current token or refresh it and then give us a new token. And if it acquires token silent, we'll check the expiration date, and if it's expired, it'll get a new token. And then in a real app, that token that we get from the result is what we would put in an authorization header. So I'm just kind of like typing in like that bearer access token. You've probably seen that if you've called APIs. And this is how we would get that access token. So we would call acquired token silent. It would be returned as result.access token. We can put that into a subsequent request. So that should work. Let's press the button and see if it did work. And it did. So there's our access token, and that looks pretty good. And then if you can always look at these access tokens to see if they have the payload that you think they should, by going to for the Microsoft ones, so jwt.ms is a good one, and it'll show you what's inside that token. You know what the display name is, what the claims are, all that stuff. So that's about it there. So the last method that we wanted to implement is logout. So it's good to have a logout process if the user wants to intentionally log out of the application. We can do that fairly easily with MSAL. So let's implement that function. Okay, this starts out the same almost as showing a token or getting a token. We'll get the active account, which again is the login process will set the active account for the global object. So we'll just get back the same account that was used to log in. It's good to kind of check to make sure you actually have an active account. I kind of skip that here, but you can actually see whether it's, is it a null. But here we'll just do a logout redirect. So instance logout redirect will ask the user to log out of the application with Entra, and we await that because it is something that has user interaction. And when it comes back, we use the redirect URI that we programmed into the environment to redirect back to the app. And you can see this browser utils is being used here. That's what we're using that for. If there is some kind of problem, we're just logging in a console. Generally, there's not going to be a real problem here. Although checking that the active account was valid before doing the logout is probably a good idea, but I didn't do it in this example to keep it shorter. Okay, so that's implemented. So let's go ahead and test it. So back to our browser. Now let's hit that red logout button, and Entra is asking us which account do we want to log out of, because we might have 2 or 3. So once we click that, then the logout will happen, and the redirect will be executed after it comes back. And then we can go back and log in again. Then we can log in again if we want. So we'll go ahead and log in, show the token, so we're logged back in. Now the last thing I want to show you is that silent login, because we haven't seen that yet. But in this case, this browser is already logged in. So we're going to browse to the app in a new tab, click login, and this time you notice we did not get challenged on the username. And if we look at the log, we can see the silent login was tried, it worked, it returned a current user, and therefore there was no need to run the pop-up. Okay, we're done. So let's review what we did. We created an app registration in Entra. We put in the URLs that we'll use for the application. The most important one is the production one. So that will whitelists that only applications running on that URL can actually use the registration. And then we grabbed the client ID and the tenant ID that we use to configure a single page application with an app registration. And then it was optional, but we went ahead and configured the application as an enterprise app that only allows certain Entra users to use it. And we at first didn't configure that, so it created an error for the user. But then we went back into Entra and added the user that we wanted to have access to the app, and they did. The next thing we did is created a React application. We added the MSAL dependencies and libraries to it. We added code for login, logout, and getting a refreshed access token. And we tested all that, found that it worked. We tested each of the paths. So, login silent, login with pop-up, and just the error path when things don't work, that we got, good errors, and we understood what actually happened. Well, I hope you learned something and this is helpful for your applications. I'll see you next time.